Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to talk about the early stories of Leonard Michaels. His first collection, Going Places, was published in 1969. It's collected here in the Collected Stories of Leonard Michaels. And it is an incredibly transgressive collection. Michaels has a very unique voice that feels ripped off the street. His characters, in a sense, are sort of the character's id is on display and sort of being screamed out, thrown out to horrifying effect. These are incredibly aggressive, downright violent stories. Physically violent, emotionally violent, mentally violent. In at least one story, it's sexually violent. There's something that is absolutely horrifying in the lives that Michaels captures. He uses a first-person voice in some, in others it's a third-person voice that has a tendency to be from the man's perspective, and it levels a sense of destruction about the city. Most of these stories are set in New York City, and there's something that feels very ripped from the heart, and ripped from a heart that is a black hole in some of these stories. So I really caution readers, if that's not something you're at all interested in, you are not going to enjoy Going Places. You're not going to learn much from it. I don't think folks will appreciate the raw nature of Michael's voice or the interesting things he does with narrative here. These are stories about people who are damaged and do damage to each other. There's trauma across these pages. But if that is something that you find to be a powerful voice in fiction, there are very few writers who conjure a voice like Leonard Michaels does. And so I want to give a sense of a couple of his stories, the voice he has, and then from there talk just a little bit about maybe some connections, recommendations for where people might want to go. And so here we go. This is in City Boy. We have a couple of stories that have a character, Philip, and this is our first story with Philip. He goes, I was the A train, the Fifth Avenue bus. I could be a cop. My name was Philip, my style, New York City. Great line. I poked the elevator button with my toe. It rang in the lobby, waking Ludwig. He'd come for me, rotten with sleep. Not the first time. He always took me down, walked me through the lobby, and let me out on the avenue. Wires began tugging him up the shaft. I moved back, conscious of my genitals hanging upside down. Absurd consideration. We were both men one way or another. There were social distinctions enforced by his uniform, but they would vanish at the sight of me. The unaccommodated thing itself. Off ye lendings! The greatest play is about a naked man. Picture of Lear came to me, naked, racing through the wheat. I could be cool. I thought of Ludwig's uniform hat, whipcord collar. It signified his authority. Perhaps he would be annoyed in his authority by the sight of me naked. Few people woke him at such hours. Worse, I never tipped him. Could I have been so indifferent month after month? In a crisis, you discover everything. Then it's too late. Know yourself indeed. You need a crisis every day. I refused to think about it. I sent my mind after objects. It returned with the chairs, settee, table, and chandelier. Where were my clothes? I sent it along the rug. It found buttons, eagles stamped in brass. I recognized them as the buttons on Ludwig's coat. Eagles, beaks like knives, shrieking for tips. And that gives a sense. It's just rapid fire sentences. It's not quite a stream of consciousness, but there's a series of associations that sort of just cascade out of this character's mind. None of the sentences are long. There's no winding, sinuous movement here for Philip. He is just bang, 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 bang. It's almost as if like every heartbeat is a new sentence for him, and his heart's beating quickly. But we're also told there he's standing there nude in front of an elevator in the middle of the night because he's fled his girlfriend's apartment, having been caught with her by her father. And so the rest of City Boy is about Philip trying to make his way back to his apartment in New York City at this hour without any clothes, without any resources. And how is he going to manage this? And there's humor within the story. But there's also this just sense of the otherworldly. There's the best element of Michaels at his very, very best is drawing on the traditions of Gogol, of even Bernard Malamud, taking that aspect of sort of the magical realism that had come out of the Russian Empire and then transplanted into New York City, and that's the voice that Michaels is best at. He takes things that feel so close to reality and yet are just absolutely reality taken to such an extreme that it veers between satire and absurdism and then back to moments that feel utterly human and utterly terrifying. And those are the best features of Michaels as a writer, is when he can do that. But he doesn't always do that. He doesn't always succeed in that. But when he does, there's nobody else who quite gets to that point. He's sort of this explosion of that tradition of Gogol and that Bernard Malamud had picked up sort of in the 1940s and 1950s. And in the late 1960s, Michaels just takes it out to an incredible limit. Far surpassing, I would say, even the transgressive, Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth. Michaels is out on a limb, at the edge of the forest, and Philip Roth is somewhere much closer to the foot of the mountain. But in another one, this is another example. This is how Sticks and Stones starts. And notice how the sentences just sort of flow again. But what that masks. It was a blind date. She met me at the door and smiled nicely. I could tell she was disappointed. Fortunately, I had brought a bottle of bourbon, an expensive brand, though not a penny too much for a positive Weltanschauung. I felt disappointed too. We finished the bourbon and were sitting on the couch. She stuttered the tale of her life and named her favorite authors. I'd never met a girl who stuttered. Our hands became interlocked and hot. Our knees touched. Both of us were crying. I cried for her. She, moved by my tears, cried for me. Beyond the room, our sobs and her breaking, retrogressive voice. I heard church bells. I squeezed her hands, shook my head, and staggered from the couch to a window. Glass broke, I fainted, and minutes later awoke on a porch just below the window. She was kneeling beside my head, smoking a cigarette. I heard her voice repeating consonants, going on with the story of her life. A bad man, accident, disease. Broken glass lay about me like stars. Church bells rang the hour, then the half hour. I lay still, thinking of nothing, full of mood. Cloth moved smoothly across her thighs as she breathed and rocked to the measures of her story. He concludes that paragraph noting, we shook like unhealthy, feverish things. And there we have, Michaels takes this very mundane sentence structure where it's just snap, 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 declarative sentence, declarative sentence, declarative sentence. There's almost no break in it. And that masks the fact that this character has fallen out of a window and crashed and probably been knocked out for at least a minute or two on the ground. And then it's just sort of laying there as time continues to pass by, but it's just sentence, 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 sentence. And there's something intentional there. But I think that passage also reveals one of the limitations that exist with Leonard Michaels stories. I had said, these are not stories for everyone. And perhaps in some mode, they're not stories for anyone. I don't think any of us want to lead the life of the characters of Leonard Michaels. They head to sort of a gutter of the soul that is frankly terrifying. And the way that his characters treat each other and interact with each other in aggression and destruction is just absolutely appalling. But the one sort of issue that I have to wrestle with anytime I read a story of his, his fiction, is as much as it's sort of this sense of aggression and destruction that's dished out to everyone, because so many of his stories have a point of view that is either a first person from a guy or a third person limited that's focused in a guy's mind. Because we're with that character, it veers towards misogyny. And that's something that I think is unavoidable with Leonard Michaels' fiction. In the Nachman stories at the very end of his career, he kind of gets away from that. But in his most raw stories, in his first two collections, Going Places and I Would Have Saved Them If I Could. Yeah, I would have saved them if I could. I always mix up if it's that or I could have saved them if I would. But I would have saved them if I could in Going Places. His raw, transgressive stories, there is this path where, because of who his narrators are, that feels that there's a clearly misogynistic sense in them. So as I said, these stories are not for everyone. But if we look at it from the perspective of this is almost this misanthropic nature, that these are all characters hurting each other, hurting themselves, sort of venting of spleen on a cosmic level, that is utterly personal and utterly subjective for these characters. There is a power to these stories. But he can also just go into really strange places. So the story Making Changes notes, the hall was clogged with bodies, none of them hers, but who could be sure? The light was bad, there was too much noise, too much movement, too many people had been invited, more kept arriving. I liked it, but it was hard to get from one room to another. Conversation was impossible. People had to lean close and shriek. It killed the effect of wit, looking into nostrils, shrieking, what? What? But it was a New York scene, I liked it. Except she was missing, virtually torn out of my hands. And this narrator then heads in to the kitchen area, and he meets a couple who are talking. The lady was saying, slam, clang, sexual enlightenment, the keystone of modernity, I dare say can hardly be considered an atavistic intellectual debauch, Cosmo. But the perversions, to be sure, the perversions of which we are so richly conscious are the natural inclination, indeed the style of civilized beings. I found a paper cup. It was not about the rim, but no cigarettes were shredding on the bottom. I sloshed in bourbon and started to leave, afraid she was pervulating. Wait there, you. I stopped. And he then gets into this conversation with these two older people talking, who are there to observe the party scene of 1960s New York City. And our narrator is sort of just absolutely getting hammered out of his mind. He's looking for the woman he came with, and this whole time there's this other observational conversation going on. It's totally ridiculous, it's totally absurd, and it's totally Michael's. So let me know if you've read any of his books. As I said, there's a real physical nature to these books. There, in terms of trigger warnings, there is sexual violence in at least one of the stories. It's like explicit. There's self-harm from a couple of characters. Michael's had experienced that in his life. He had one wife who did die by suicide, and so he wrote a book trying to explore her life and their relationship together called Sylvia. But there is a tragedy, a personal tragedy that shades all of his fiction. And he has a very unique voice. So let me know if anyone's read his stories, but as I said, this is one that was sort of, when I was curious if others have read. As I said, the stories of Gogol, I think, are a clear sort of reference point for Michael's, especially at his best. The early works of Philip Roth, whether in Goodbye Columbus, feels positively saccharine and sweet compared to Michael's, or even Portnoy's Complaint, I think, is really sort of a contemporaneous book to Going Places, and even that feels, frankly, less transgressive than what Michael's is accomplishing. The writings of Henry Miller, the Sexus Plexus Nexus, Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn, those feel like a reference point for Michael's. I had mentioned Bernard Malamud. I'd say especially his short stories, not so much his novels, but his short stories I think were a clear influence for Michael's. Another somewhat contemporaneous writer would have been Jerzy Kosinski, especially with Steps. Steps came out in between Going Places and Michael's second collection. This gets pretty close to the raw, sort of unfiltered, terrifying nature of Going Places. Another writer who was formerly much more experimental than Michael's, but his stories feel totally unlike anyone else's, would of course be Donald Barthelme. Someone like John Updike was writing stories that present a far more suburban viewpoint in much more elegant style, but the narrative and the description and the subject matter is really not that different from some of Updike's stories, or certainly a novel like Couples, or even A Month of Sundays, compared to the stories of Leonard Michaels. Harold Brodkey's First Love and Other Sorrows, sort of from the late 1950s. This is much less transgressive, but there are passages where Brodkey sort of gets at this idea. And then in the 1980s, we have someone like Jay McInerney with Bright Lights, Big City, who sort of takes some of Michael's style and updates it to the 1980s. In terms of another writer who sort of takes that idea and pushes it forward in interesting, I would say the stories of Lydia Davis. I don't think she's influenced by Michael's necessarily in any way, but she too has this very singular voice where she's able to capture what sounds like a real voice off the off the street or out of the phone and on the page in the way that Michael's does. And then finally, I would add the stories of Isaac Babel, particularly those from Red Cavalry. The subject matter is totally different, but the style there, this very terse, quick style where sort of important truths are revealed among the most mundane circumstances is present. Perhaps Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son. And then in terms of another work that is incredibly powerful, I would add Last Words from Montmartre by Chiu Mia-jin. So, as I said, let me know if anyone else has read anything by Leonard Michaels. I don't almost ever hear him discussed, and perhaps it's because he really just represents something that we don't need to be reading, but he has a singular voice that I think pushes out in every direction. So let me know what you think. Thank you.